Greetings, everybody. So finally, I get to record the first lecture and introduce the course to you. I'm sorry, I would have preferred to have done this yesterday, but I think you got my message. Some of you got my message. My neighbor, literally, that share my fence down there. It's a river down there, and the river, I've never seen it like that. I've never seen anything like that, actually, except on TV. It's entire, I mean, the basement, okay. That happens to, my basement was flooded, the cellar, but the water went into, it was 3 feet up in his entire downstairs, everything ruined. And it swept away the entire side of the house. Can you believe that? The side of the house is deposited on the front of the road over there. Poor man, that's so bad for him. So all day yesterday, I was 13 hours over there from, 7 till 8. Just chainsawing a big tree had come down, had to be chainsawed up, and then anyway, I won't go on, but here we are. And welcome, greetings. Let me keep an eye on the clock up there. So we'll try to keep this to 1 hour and 20 minutes. We have 2 sessions, and let me introduce the course. So this is Hindu philosophy, and we'll look at the syllabus today, read a verse from the Rig Veda, and then start to read a couple of verses from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So let me introduce some of these texts that we're going to be looking at. I know you may be the first week or more than the first week, you have a chance to decide if you like the course, if you like the instructor. So, so you have a drop ad period. So let's see if we can give you a bit of a sense of what we'll be covering. Hindu philosophy. We can start with the word philosophy, obviously the love of wisdom. But there were discussions actually. Once actually goes back to the ancient Greeks. We can trace this discussion origins of the ancient Greeks, when the Greeks were wondering, well, was their philosophy indigenous, or was it borrowed from the Occident, from the Orient? Which for them might have meant Egypt even, or, perhaps the Phoenicians. So there was this discussion, and some took the view that it was indigenous, and some took the view that it was borrowed from the East. But there was one voice there who mentioned the Indians. Indians were often called the gymnosophists, actually, the naked, wise people. Probably goes back to Alexander's day. Alexander famously met Greek philosophers, and we have all of these very interesting stories of. He was fascinated because Alexander I think he was a disciple of Aristotle. Anyway, he may have had this sort of philosophical inclination, even though he butchered his way across Asia just for his ego, but nonetheless. So he was fascinated by the Greek sages, and you get reports in Greek sources of these naked sadhus just sitting naked, exposed to intense heat and cold, and seemingly unaffected. There's even a story that Alexander tried to bring one of them back, or the Greeks tried to bring one of them back to Greece, and he just entered in front of the whole Greek army. He just entered the fire in front of them all, to demonstrate, a bit like Socrates perhaps with his poison, to demonstrate that he was not afraid of death, that death was not in his mind, it was nothing but a moment that his essence, his consciousness, his Atman, one of the terms we'll be encountering, was eternal. And then the Greeks they had different impressions of this. Some were very impressed, they were just amazed, he was totally fearless, and others thought that was a waste of a human life. So obviously there would be different points of view. But a fascination with Indian yogis goes back to, we find that in Greek sources. And famously Alexander, sent his men to bring a sage. So he wanted to talk to the sage, and the sage said, if Alexander wants to talk to me, he can come here. Who is he? He's just a man, he's a mortal, he's wandering around the earth creating trouble for everybody. I'm not going to go and see him. I'm quite happy where I am. Thank you very much. and Alexander had to, Alexander was impressed. I mean, he's not used to people talking to him like that. And he went fairly respectfully and had a conversation with the sage. So we have these accounts, almost all very favorable of the ancient Greek sophists. They were sophists. They were interested in knowledge. Sophists. So, but right from there, we find a discussion about the origins of Greek philosophy. And one voice says, well, the Indians, they're great, they're sophists, but they don't do philosophy like we do, because they already start with a presupposition. They start with a presupposition that there's a God or there's an Atman. And therefore they're bound in that way. From that point onwards, there might be brilliant thinkers, but because they already start with an assumption or a presumption, then they don't do what we do, which is we just let knowledge take us wherever it's going to take us. They have this idea, which is then picked up in the Enlightenment by later European thinkers when they encounter Indian thought, right? The first time would be in the late 1700s. And it took decades for Europeans to, find Brahmins willing to teach them and translate the texts. I mean, eventually, if you pay somebody, they'll do anything. So eventually, they found Brahmins that were willing. Some Brahmins that were willing. Many Brahmins wouldn't touch them, wouldn't go near meat eaters. They're impure. Lechers, they're called Yavanas. They're called Yavanas in traditional sources. And Yavana is a term that goes back to Ionia, so probably connected with Alexander's Greek, origins. So the Ionians, when that becomes Sanskritized, becomes Yavanas. So anyway, so this idea that they don't do philosophy, that gets picked up, and of course, by the Enlightenment, you have the beginnings of colonialism. And what's colonialism? It's nothing other than racism, essentially. How else would you go out and conquer the world other than telling yourself the story that you're superior, your civilization is superior, and these poor natives need your higher civilization. So that gets picked up, and India gets denied the, Indian thought, even though Westerners were very impressed. Some of them, not all of them, extremely impressed. But often, a fairly frequent position would be that it's not really philosophy. And this, it is true, as we will see, as we will go to study, that many of the Indian schools do have a canonical text that they start with, whether it's the Upanishads that we're going to read today, and they do accept those as absolute truth, just like a Christian would, or a Muslim. So, and in that sense, one could make a case that, they're starting off with a presupposition that in some ways restricts the free intellectual pursuit of knowledge. I think we can be careful about accepting statements like that. First of all, they tend to be racist. Underneath that proposal, there is a subtle, even if it's not explicit, there's a subtle sense that, well, Westerners are more rational. They're freer thinkers, and therefore you have thinkers saying that's why science evolves from the West, because of this freedom, intellectual freedom. We should be careful of buying into those kinds of discourses. First of all, there were numerous Indian thinkers that did not subscribe to a pre-existing sacred text, like the Buddha. Even though, of course, after the Buddha delivers his teaching, then the Buddha's teachings for later Buddhists becomes paramount, becomes a sort of like is a placeholder for they become sacred texts. But they were materialists. There's Charvaka, never accepted any sacred text. They were materialists. They didn't accept any God or soul. And there were the logicians, the school of logicians. They might have accepted in principle in some sort of, but their whole system of argumentation never quotes sacred texts. They use reason and argument. So we have the school of logicians, which we're going to be studying. So it's certainly not true. And even those that did accept formally some kind of a sacred text, a sutra is a term, Vedanta sutra is a genre of writing, and it's used for that genre of writing where technical information is preserved. So all the different schools, a number of the different schools had their sutra, their canonical text. So the Vedanta school, you'll become familiar with all these terms. At the Vedanta Sutra, the Yoga school, Yoga Sutra, that's now become canonical in the West. If you do a yoga teacher training course, go down the high street in any town, and they have yoga studios. And if you want to sign up for a teacher training course, you have to study 20 hours of the Yoga Sutra. So that's no longer an ancient Indian text. That's become part of our. I mean, yoga. There's tens of millions of people in the West studying yoga. So now the Yoga Sutras has become part of our, at least part of the canonical text for the yoga community. So each school has its sutra, and that becomes its. And then the sutras then have commentaries over the centuries. Later thinkers, unpack the sutras. So you could say, well, but they start off with a sutra, so they're starting off with a restricted access to knowledge, because they have to defend the sutra, they have to defend their canonical text, just like the Christian theologian has to accept the Bible. And you might be creative, but essentially you're anchored in the Bible. So in that sense, it's a limit to innovative thinking. It's not true. It's not. If there is any truth in it, it's problematic, because as we'll see from the Vedanta Sutra, you might have a canonical text, but the vast differences of philosophical positions that claim to be following that sutra text, but are radically different from each other, really indicate that having a sutra is really not. It's not a limitation. So, for example, we'll be looking at Shankara, and for him, the world is unreal. It's an illusion. One of the great Vedanta thinkers, Shankara, 8th, 9th century. World is an illusion, doesn't exist. The soul is not an individual. Its individuality is imagined. And there's only Brahman. There's only pure consciousness. And the soul is not, once it becomes free from ignorance and illusion, it, like a drop of water, merges into the ocean. It's no longer an individual. So there's no world, only Brahman, only pure, all-pervading consciousness. Anything else is a superimposition of illusion, superimposed, like a mirage superimposed on the desert. There's no water in the desert, but a person could superimpose that notion of water and see a mirage, see a lake there. So that for Shankara, the world is like that. Well, 100 years later, the next famous Vedantin, for him, the world is completely real, and the God is a distinct being, and the soul is an individual. So how much more difference can you get? No God, no soul, no world, just Brahman, just consciousness. We'll become a lot familiar with this, and don't freak out. I'm throwing a lot of stuff. It's an introduction. Going through all of this. We've got 13 weeks together, my friends. Shankara, no world, no soul, no God, just Brahman. Ramanuja, real world. It is what we see. There's a supreme being behind it, intelligence, supporting it, maintaining it. And the souls are individual, eternally individual. You're not me, I'm not you. We're beyond our physicality and psychophysical nature. Even on the deep level of pure consciousness, we're distinct. So all of which is to say, even if you do have a canonical text, is it really does it really stifle critical thinking? I suggest not. And finally, even if we go along with all of that, well, what do you do if you do a degree in the philosophy department? You're reading canonical texts. You can't do a degree. In Rutgers has, I think, best philosophy department in the world, or sometimes best, sometimes second best. It goes backwards and forwards with NYU, I am told. But you have to read Plato and Aristotle. What are those other than canonical texts? And they affect your thinking. They condition your thinking. You might say, well, I'm not bound to them, in the same way as a Vedanta thinker is bound to a Vedanta Sutra, but actually they become part of your mind. And that way your mind becomes conditioned and you see things a certain way. Why is it, Eastern thinkers' reincarnation is obvious. It's philosophically obvious. It might have been in Plato, Plotinus, but that really hasn't been a major feature of later Western thought. So the mind gets conditioned by even if you study Western philosophy, you study Hegel, you study Kant. There is a set of thinkers you have to study in your introduction. You're forced to. You have to do your basic, introductory courses. Expose you to to these seminal thinkers. So that's sort of like a canon. It's maybe not quite as rigid as a sutra, but it does, you are starting off with a set chosen body of thinkers. So all of which is to say, you might run into this idea that Indian thought is not really philosophy in the same way as Western thought is. I would be very careful of buying into that. And usually there's racist undertones. In the colonial period, Indian thought was considered to be mystical. Why? Because many Indian thinkers, the goal of thinking isn't just to think forever. What's the point of that? Just think forever and ever, then you die. Then what? How is that all useful to you at the moment of death? When you're dying, if you don't accept any truth and just keep probing, then you're dying. Now what? What are you going to do? What are you going to cling to? What's the mind going to cling to at the moment of death? So Indian thinkers, for them, the goal of philosophy is precisely to liberate the being inside, the internal, deep level being, from the cycle of birth and death. But otherwise, it's just stupid, foolish, wasteful intellectual speculation that just churns forever. Someone comes up with a theory, somebody else deconstructs it and comes up with another theory, and you can go on forever. And that is the history of Western thought, and science too, but in a good way. In a good way when it comes to science, because you're probing, and it's not bad. It's a good way in philosophy too, but there is never any conclusion to it. And for Indian thinkers, the fact is life does conclude. It concludes at death. And therefore, it's, from their point of view, it's better to sort of cling to some kind of a view that's going to help you at that moment, rather than no view at all. And so Indian thought is connected to liberation, the notion of moksha, in nirvana in Buddhism. Not all Indian thought. There were materialists that didn't accept liberation. But that just seems to be like the proper use of philosophy is to actually help one be free of suffering. And suffering means embodiment. And as long as we're in a body, we act. As long as we act, we create karma. As long as we create karma, we get the fruits of karma. And if we get the fruits, part of the fruits of karma is reincarnation, which means coming back for more suffering. All of this we'll discuss, my friends. I know I'm throwing this out really fast, but I just want to hit you with a few. So don't worry if you didn't get all of that. Please, I'm just, it's an introductory course. I'm just throwing things at you, and I want you to get a little bit of sense what lies ahead. Okay, let's look at the syllabus. Pull it up on your screens. Hit the pause button if you don't have it. Go into Canvas, get it up, come back and join us. There's only one course book, and that's God and the World's Arrangement. We will read that entire thing. It should be at the Douglas Co-op, but I think most students nowadays get their own from Amazon, or you probably know where to get cheap books. Shouldn't be expensive. It's a little thin paperback. I'm sorry, I left it inside. I should have brought it. We'll be reading that entire thing. And then the rest is all on Sakai. They're selections, right? Today we'll start off with the Rig Veda, and then we have selections from the Upanishads. I'll introduce what they are, what is the Veda, what are the Upanishads. Then we have the Vedanta Sutra, also known as the Brahma Sutra, number 3 on the required reading list. So you heard me mention in the preamble about the Vedanta Sutra. Well, another name for Vedanta Sutra is Brahma Sutras. It's about Brahman, the ultimate cause of all causes. The absolute truth is called Brahman in Vedanta. Okay, so the first sutra of Vedanta Sutra, Tattva Brahma Jignasu. Now we're going to inquire into Brahman. What is the ultimate truth of reality? That's called Brahman. Now, Brahman is going to be understood very differently in different schools. That we'll encounter later on. But everyone accepts the name Brahman as the name for that absolute truth. What it is will be debated and differed upon. Then we have, and the fourth on the list is the Shloka Vartika, very quick little, the atheists, these are the ritualists. They are perpetuating the old Vedic ritual, offerings into the fire for the, higher being, celestial beings. And for them, the Veda is eternal. They don't like the idea that there's a God even that there's a God that reveals the Veda. The Veda are the old texts that we'll talk about in a minute, most ancient texts. So for them, they want the sacrifice to be eternal, and the injunctions towards performing sacrifice, right? They're the old the ritualists. So their understanding of reality, their duty within reality, they're the Brahman caste, is to perpetuate the old Vedic rituals. So they don't even want a God to be in the picture. The ritual itself is the ultimate and the absolute. So we'll look at their arguments against Īśvara, because if the Veda is eternal, that means that, you know, it was never spoken. So then why do you need a God to speak it? So they're going to argue against even a divine, you know, a perfect being speaking the Veda, because then that would mean the Veda is revealed. That would mean it's not eternal. They want it to be eternal because they want the sacrifice to be so enshrined in the very nature of the cosmos. They're not even comfortable with the idea that it was spoken by God. So they argue against. So we'll look at some of the Shloka Vartika as a text by Kumarila Bhatta. As I recall, 8th, 9th century. I got to get my dates. But remember to look up the dates. Pretty sure it's 8th century. Shloka Vartika. And that section of the Shloka Vartika is the canonical, one of the texts of the Mimamsa school. Mimamsa is one of the schools of ancient Indian intellectuality. There are various schools, and one of the old ritualists. And they have to defend that, why, people are going to say, why we have to do these old rituals? So they have to come up with a philosophical reason for it. So they become powerful philosophers. And so one of the later theologians, so later meaning 8th century, but later the old Vedic ritual goes back to 2000 BCE. We might want to say that the Vedic Sanskrit, the language of the Vedas, is the oldest Indo-European language that we have in literary form. So there's an Indo-European language family, right? Greek, Latin, Germanic, Slavic, and Persian too. Not Arabic or Hebrew, but Persian, all part of this ancient language. But it goes back to some language that's lost in the mist of time. We have no record of it, but we know it must have existed. Just like if Latin was lost, imagine there was no record of anything written in Latin. Imagine all the books were burned. Just looking at modern Italian and Spanish and Portuguese, we would infer they must have come from they're so close, they must have come from a mother language. And of course, we know that they did. They came from Latin, and we have tons of stuff in Latin. But imagine there were no books in Latin. You could still know that there must have been a language, and you could try to reconstruct it from the daughter languages. Well, that's what historical Indo-European linguists do. They know there was an ancient primordial language that was the mother of Persian, Sanskrit on the eastern side, and also most of the Western languages, not Hungarian, not Finnish, not Basque in the north of Spain, but all the other languages that are presently spoken in Europe. So English is Anglo-Saxon, part of the Germanic language families. And that in turn goes back to this ancient Indo-European. So the Vedas are the oldest literature. The Vedic ritualism goes back, in later forms of it, we see in Greco-Roman ritualism. And the ritualism that actually pervaded the ancient world, all language families had some form of rituals, the things were offered into fire. That was really probably the main religion of the entire ancient world, Mesoamerica, China. Anyway, so we look at these Vedic ritualists. They're trying to keep these old rites going. And to do that, they can't just tell people, well, you have to do sacrifice. People are becoming Buddhists, they're becoming they're turning to in other sorts of directions. So they have to keep people performing what they believe are the Vedic rituals that are essential for the maintenance of the universe, for the ongoingness of the universe. But the universe is perpetuated by Vedic ritual. So therefore, the Vedas, the ritual itself is eternal. Something is eternal. That's a pretty strong argument for saying it. We should be performing, that which is eternal and which perpetuates the rising of the sun and the well-being of the universe. So, but then at a certain point, people are challenging that and saying, you're just a bunch of priests. You're just ripping us off. we're not gonna give you charity. We're not gonna pay for the rituals anymore. So you have to come up with a good, solid, convincing, and therefore intellectual, and therefore philosophical defense. So we see, and so part of that then is to reject the idea there's an Īśvara. That's reading number 4, and then we have a few readings. We have 2 weeks where we look at the atheists. This course is focused on God. First time I've actually taught a course just focused on God in Indian thought. Normally I do an overview of just Indian thought in general, but now I'm doing a thematic. We're going to have a thematic focus, and I'm really quite excited about it. But don't worry, you'll still get the same overall glimpse at what we would do in I've been teaching this 25 years at least. You'll still get, I think, what everybody has gotten in the past in terms of a sort of an overview of Indian thinking, because we'll have to deal with things like karma and reincarnation, because one school will say, well, karma, the laws of cause and effect, everything you do has a result. Well, who oversees that? They're going to say there needs to be an intelligent being that oversees that the right effects is connected to the right cause. At the same time, that everybody else's effects are being connected to their causes, right? So I'm sitting at the table here. Well, there's ants underneath me. Well, at this moment, that ant is underneath me. Well, the fact that the ant is there and I'm here, our karma is interconnected with everything. The blades of grass growing in my yard, the leaves and the tree behind me. Well, that's just, you need an omniscient being to oversee that everything, the right causes are connected to the right effects and so forth. So you will get an overview of Indian philosophy, is what I'm saying. So we have a couple of weeks looking at the non-theists, the first of the ritualists we just mentioned. And then we have reading number 5, Dharmakirti's Buddhist. And again, and then also number 6, principled atheism in the Buddhist scholastic traditions. Buddhism is a whole field unto itself. It's not my specialty. We have an excellent Buddhist philosopher in our department, Professor Tao Zhang. If you are interested in Buddhism, you might think about one of his courses next semester or some other semester. Okay, so we'll be looking at they're non-theists. The Buddha is not God for them. It's just an enlightened being. And any Buddhist or anyone can become a Buddha. So that's not the same as God, right? God is a unique individual that one cannot ever become. And the term for God is Īśvara. That's the primary term. We'll run into other terms. And for now, Īśvara, being with supreme power, is Īśvara. Then we look at the Jains, another tradition. So we have Buddhism emerges from India. And of course, we've heard about Buddhism because obviously the East becomes Buddhist and it's kind of popular in the West now, Buddhism, since the 60s counterculture. But there is another very influential, but it never preached, never left the boundaries of India. The Jains, very important sect, tradition, and cluster. There's a couple of different, at least 2 different main branches of Jainism, and probably lots of smaller branches again. They're also non-theists. The Jain Mahavira, their founder, is not God, but enlightened being, and we're encouraged to all become jinnas, or enlightened beings. So that would be, and then we have we have 4 different schools, and with 4 different traditions who take non-theistic positions. Okay? Īśvara is God, and those who oppose God are called Nir. Nir means no. Nir Īśvara. And Vada is a point of view. You can put it with anything. A Vada is a point of view. So Buddhism is a Bodha Vada, a teachings of the Buddha. And a person who follows a Vada is a Vadin. Vadin is the one who follows a Vada. And there can be unlimited numbers of Vadas, or just Vada just means a school or a point of view. So, whatever. Those who believe in string theory would be string theory Vada. That would be string theory Vada, the philosophy of the scientific proposal that the string theory underpins reality. That would be string theory Vada. And those proposing that, because not all scientists accept that, will be the Vardins, string theory Vardins. Okay, so let's slowly build up our vocabulary. Don't freak out. We will be repeating these words many times. So Jains then, and then we have in reading number 8, another Veda. So the Jains and Buddhists are not Vedic, meaning they don't follow the Vedas. They do not subscribe to, you know, what we now call Hinduism, which, by the way, is not a term that we find in the ancient text. We don't see that term before the 15th century. That's introduced from the outside by Persian speakers and early, you know, the early Muslim invaders into India used the term Hindu for those living on the other side of the Indus River. It's a geographical term originally. Now it comes to mean those traditions which consider themselves Vedic. But we'll see that real modern day Hinduism has very little to do with the old Rig Veda ritualism. But that doesn't matter. That's not. That's something we might mention again if we run into it. So, but there were those that severed themselves, Indian thinkers that severed themselves or never considered themselves to be a part, in the first place, to be a part of the Vedic tradition. And the Buddha would be, it's not clear if the Buddha, he never rejected the Vedas. Exactly when Buddhism became non-Vedic, scholars are not clear about that, because you have 400 years before the texts were written. At some point, certainly early Buddhists were Brahmins and doing Vedic ritualism. Buddha never rejected the Veda. He said, okay, you're going to be a Brahmin, be a real Brahmin. You know, so he was, you know, in that sense, he was a critic of corrupt Brahmanism, but it's not clear that he ever rejected the Vedas. But anyway, at a certain point, Buddhism does become non-Vedic. And now, if you buy it, you know, Intro to Indian Philosophy, you'll get, you know, a chapter on the materialists, a chapter on the Jains, a chapter on the Buddhists, and then you get the 6 Vedic schools. And the Jains and Buddhists are non-Vedic. The Jains are also do not accept the Vedas as their canonical text, as their sacred text. That's what I mean when I say they don't accept the Vedas. They might reject them, or they might just not accept them as divine texts that they feel they need to follow, or even you know, because most Hindus don't follow the Vedas. Those are ancient fire sacrifices with ancient chants, but at least they pretend to. And what do I mean by that? At least they tip their hat, or they acknowledge, just like most Christians don't follow the rules of the Old Testament, but they accept that the Old Testament is part of the Bible, it's part of their sacred tradition, right? But if you read the Old Testament, it's pretty, you know, it's very distant from the sorts of things that most Christians believe in or follow. Most Christians follow the New Testament. So likewise, the old Vedas are, but at least, you know, Hindus consider themselves to be Vaidika, meaning of following the Vedas. Okay, so 4 non-theistic positions. Then we get back to, this is our reading list. Then we have a short section from my own commentary and translation of the Yoga Sutras, which is theistic. Then we're looking at the Bhagavad Gita, God in the Bhagavad Gita. So you get a chance, these 2 texts, the Yoga Sutras and the Gita, now part of our Western, certainly anyone involved in yoga, anyone involved in Eastern philosophy, anyone involved in yoga philosophy they're reading these 2 texts, the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita. They're not reading the old Vedic texts, they never heard of us. But they are reading these 2 because the great teachers of yoga that came to the West in the 60s, and I do have to keep an eye on the clock. I don't want to, if I keep doing that, it's not because I don't want to be here, it's just that I'm trying to be responsible and stick to time. Okay, so we'll be reading the Bhagavad Gita, and then finally we'll look at Īśvara, God, in the not so much philosophical traditions, but in real life Hinduism, where God assumes the form. We'll be looking at God in the form of Krishna, the speaker of the Gita, and also the life of Krishna briefly at the end of the semester. And then we'll talk about how that God manifests in human space and time, and manifests wonderful forms, beautiful qualities, and does cool stuff in the world, which is called Leela. All right, so let's quickly go through the readings. We'll be doing the Upanishads for the first couple of weeks. There, Upanishad is the oldest text in Sanskrit of the Vedas. We're just going to look, and then there's not much philosophy there. There's maybe very early proto-philosophy. We'll be looking at one verse from the Rig Veda, which is late Veda, where scholars like to think of it as sort of the beginnings, the earliest, literary. Who knows? We don't know what people. Surely they were philosophers, but nothing was recorded. We don't have any record of the earliest, speculation other than what surfaces in literature. So the Rig Vedas, there's 4 Vedas, the oldest of which is the Rig. Mostly the Vedas are at least 3 of the Vedas are hymns recited during the ritual, hymns to celestial beings, mostly requesting, victory over enemy, material boons. Nothing very spiritual about them. They're beautiful chants. But if you look at the content of them, Penguin has a book on the Rig Veda. They're mostly hymns to the great celestials. And then they're chanted in Vedic meter. Agnimehele purohitam yagnasyam devam ritvijam. Sounds like that. Quite lovely to hear. But if you look at the content of the words, they're not philosophical. They're requests for material well-being, progeny, victory, cows, because cows would be economy, right? As in many parts of the world today. So, all right. So then that's a genre, and then the earliest philosophical texts of the Upanishads. So, and really the Vedic age, if we want to use the term strictly, like scholars use it, and even like traditional Indian scholars use it, it ends at the Upanishads. We have the 4 Vedas, and we have 2 other types of texts that we don't have to worry about, ritual texts and sort of in-between sort of texts. And in the Upanishads, there we find strong philosophical inclinations. We're urged to seek the truth. We encounter Brahman, the highest truth, absolute truth, the Atman, which is that expression of Brahman within you. That's your kind of individual, deep level self. But sometimes the terms are used interchangeably. Sometimes Atman can refer to the absolute, Brahman to that truth within you. So there's a very intimate connection between Atman and Brahman. Now, are they one and the same? Some schools say, yeah, absolutely, Atman is just a synonym for Brahman. Others will say, no. Atman is the spark, is a tiny expression, but an individual. So that will be a big difference between our Vedanta thinkers. So we read the Upanishads, and we start with the Brihad Aranyaka, the great forest Upanishad. Forest, why the forest? You get the sense of sages seeking truth. They're renouncing conventional world. They want to go to a place peaceful and no distractions. They go to the forest. Like from the early Christian history, those seeking God might go to the desert. Same reason. Get away from worldly temptations and distractions and nonsense. Worldly, right? All of the attractions of the world and all the nonsense. Male, female, dating, all the stuff you poor students have to go through, texting. It's just a big, think about it. You step back and think about it. It's really a kind of anxiety. Isn't it? The whole dating thing, anxiety, and all the sort of anxiety of school and grades and careers. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure there. Pressure's anxiety. So what if somebody wants to say, oh, okay, I don't want to live like that. I want to seek something deeper and higher, more meaningful. And let me go somewhere where there's no distraction there. I don't have to worry about all of this. I'll live very simply. So there's no pressure on me to sort of maintain a family or a house. I'll go somewhere where I live very simply. How about by the side of a river, just drink the river water, live in a thatched hut, eat berries of the forest. So if you're a real seeker, that'll be very attractive to you, right? I mean, think about it. If you're into, I don't know, skiing, so you're not going to go to the Bahamas. You're going to go somewhere where there's snow. And you're going to put up with all kinds of inconveniences. You live in a lodge, you're going out there in the cold, right? Other people might think you're mad, and You're dangerously gliding down a slope. Well, for you, it's wonderful. So that's logical. And you'll put up with whatever inconveniences you need to put up with to fulfill that pursuit. So if you're seeking the Atman, same logic. You've got to go somewhere where there's no distraction, where that's suitable for that. So in ancient Indian the ideal kind of location, when we see the yogis, those doing yoga meaning the pursuit of the self, pursuit of truth, the yogis are the ones doing that. They're doing yoga. They tend to be situated in the forest. Anyway, so we read the Upanishads. The first is the Brihad, the Great Forest Upanishad. Okay, now we know why the forest. And we'll look at that. We'll try and read a verse or two today. If we don't get to it today, that's fine. And then with the Chandogya, another one, and the Taittiriya, on lecture 1 and 2 on Wednesday. That will be next week. So I've just put Wednesday. That means the week's reading. Okay? You have 3 quizzes. You need to be on top of everything by the quiz. So if you're a bit behind 1 week, I'm not going to know because this is asynchronous. All I'll know is I'll tell you a week before the quiz exactly what's going to be on the quiz. Hopefully we'll follow the syllabus, but if we don't quite follow it, it's okay because I've left 2 weeks empty at the end. In case we need an extra bit of time. Spill over, and all you need to know is what you're responsible for the quiz. I'll tell you that a week before the quiz. Don't wait. Friends, not smart. Do your reading now. Listen to all the lectures. There'll be stuff on the quiz that's in the reading, but we don't get time to discuss in the lectures. And there'll be stuff in the lectures that's not on the reading. And you need to be responsible for both. So I've never had complaints about grading in this course, 25 years. It's fair. It's, multiple choice. You have 5 options. So, and we're not out to sort of try to trick anybody or ask anything unfair or difficult. Just making sure you listen to the lectures. So, for example, Indo-European and Sanskrit, that's not going to be in the reading, but it's in this lecture. So I might ask a question, well, what is the relationship between Veda and Indo-European? And that will test whether you listen to the lecture. That's not a hard question. And if you've listened to this lecture, why would that be a hard question to answer? Right? So you need to know to be up on top of the reading by the quiz. We'll tell you a week before, okay, here's the cutoff. So if we spill over or be behind, we'll figure it all out. And the week before the quiz, we say, okay, this will cover up to X. So don't worry about that. If you're committed to doing the reading and listening to the lectures, you have nothing to worry about. All right, so then we go to week 4, we start Vedanta. Now the Vedanta are, okay, the Upanishads are not really philosophy, they're early philosophy, proto-philosophy. Proto means sort of an early form of something. And we see the first philosophical kind of musings and, deep and the more wisdom teachings. Seek the self and Brahman. So not really systematic, rigorous philosophy in the way that term has come to be understood now in, say, Rutgers philosophy department. But we have critical thinking and intellectual thinking. The Vedanta Sutra are now texts written about at this point, the Vedanta Sutra is probably written 3rd century BCE. Upanishads go, they're BC, they're early. The Vedanta Sutra is 3rd century. And the Upanishads maybe is, the Brihad maybe 8th century BCE. So later thinkers feel the need to systematize those ancient Upanishads. So they write a sage called Badarayana, sometime in the 3rd century, writes the Vedanta Sutra, 500 odd verses, and it sets out to clarify the Upanishads. So each sutra it refers to a particular Upanishadic verse and tries to, and basically what Vedanta wants to try to argue is that everything in the Upanishad is about Brahman. It's about the absolute truth. The Upanishads, you read them, there may be statements that don't seem to be about Brahman. But Vedanta want to argue that everything in the Upanishads is in fact about Brahman. We'll be looking at 2 thinkers, Ramanuja, and we'll start off with he's a theist. He accepts Īśvara, I mentioned before, the world is real. Souls are real, and there's a real God. So we read his commentary in the first 5 sutras of the Vedanta Sutra. And then the second, and then in week 4, the second lecture, we'll look at Shankara. Shankara is a monist. There's only one truth, mono. And we mentioned him before as well. Everything's Brahman. So for him, there may be a God, Īśvara, and he argues for Īśvara, but only in conventional reality. Conventional meaning it's actually ultimately illusory. It's like if you see a mirage, well, the mirage, it does seem to have a lake, it does seem to have trees, it does seem to have water. So you could talk about the ingredients of the mirage, and you could talk about it in a intellectually coherent fashion and say, yeah, look at the mirage, there's this, there's that, and you can analyze it. And you can argue against people who say that there is no mirage, and it sounds a bit complicated, I know. Shankara is a bit hard to get a hold of, but we'll look at him more carefully. So Shankara is a theist, but only in conventional reality. He's going to say, ultimately, sure, there's a God. To the extent that the world is real, it has a creator. That's what he's going to defend. To the extent that there's a real world, there's the only way of understanding. The only intellectual way of making sense of this world is that there must be intelligence behind it. To say that the atoms just randomly bumped into each other, brought together by forces, as a physicalist might say, he would find that a great leap of faith. Sometimes people that believe in God, they're accused of having a leap of faith. Well, what do you call if you believe? Right, science can't prove that the molecules, subatomic particles and forces just came together with no intelligence behind it. What is that? That's also a belief. So let's call that a belief then. So theistic philosophers will find that much too big a leap of faith to be acceptable. So Shankara will be such a philosopher. Okay, and then we'll read his commentary, and we'll discuss how there are, so the sutras are the canonical texts, they're very, very short, and then Shankara is the commentary, but then, a century or two later, you get a second commentary, a commentator coming along and writing a second tier of commentary, and some of these texts have multiple tiers. You may have a dozen or many, dozen main ones, or half a dozen, then and lots of little ones that, get lost in the winds of time. So we'll be reading then the Vedanta Sutra for a couple of weeks, week 5 as well. And then we get to section 3, and you see that Īśvara, that's supposed to be Īśvara there. Atheism, arguments against Īśvara, but unfortunately the diacritics didn't transfer. Maybe Laura will fix that. Our valiant TA, you have a great TA. She's an MA student, Laura, and she'll help you she'll also conduct review sessions before the quizzes, and help you if you need any kind of technical, or if you need any help, reach out to Laura. I think she's already written to you. So maybe she'll fix that. Or maybe I just have an older version. Maybe she has fixed it. That's supposed to be arguments against Īśvara from rival schools. And we mentioned that. So there'll be 2. Now all of our course, we're reading the actual Sanskrit text, the translation of them, direct. But to read the Buddhist and Jain and the ritualists, the actual texts, it's a bit beyond it would be too much to expect from an intro course. So there we read articles. They will quote the verses, but the ones that are most user-friendly, okay? So these 4 articles that will be in section 3. The first section is Upanishad, second is Vedanta, the third are the non-theists, those arguing against God, saying that we don't need to accept the notion of a supreme being. We can explain reality quite well, thank you very much, without bringing in the notion of a supreme person, of an omniscient, omnipotent person. That would be as we mentioned, the Jains, Buddhists, and ritualists, and also a Vedika Sāṃkhya school. Don't worry about all these names. You will become familiar with them. So we'll have for 2 weeks, 2 lectures on each. That's 4 lectures on those. Or more, 5. Look, we fit into week 8 and October 15th, first quiz. The week before that, we will tell you what you're responsible for. you've done all your reading, my friends, you will not have a problem. If you haven't, then you think you're going to be able to, this is all new material, it's going to be technical, don't think you're going to be able to cram it in the last week. And anyway, we're just going to say, for the quiz, we're going to say, hopefully we're following the schedule, but if we're not, then we'll just say, well, let's just go up to, this article. Let's go up to this section for the quiz. So, do your reading. And then when you quiz time, you go back and review it. Do your reading, listen to the classes, you'll be fine. Then we start with the logicians. And this is probably the close, now we're getting close to, because Vedantins are what we would call exegetes. Exegesis is how to interpret a sacred text. So Vedanta is basically about scriptural interpretation, how to interpret the Upanishads, and they want to argue everything in the Upanishads is pointing to Brahman as the absolute cause. So week number 2, Vedanta, right? The 2 different main Vedanta positions, the monistic, world is illusion, that school, it's called Advaita, no duality, only one Brahman. Dua is 2, like not is not 2. There's an example of Indo-European. The word dua in Sanskrit and English, dual, two, dual, they all come from one ancient root, dua. And then as in English, we negate something, you put an like you say theist, atheist. This is a course on theism. And how do we negate? What's the opposite of a theist? We put an Well, they did in Sanskrit too. And why did they do it too? Because it goes back to this ancient language. So that ancient language and its grammatical features are preserved in the later languages. And here's 2 examples. So Advaita is non-dual. That's a Vedanta school that says there's no God, no soul, right? We mentioned it a couple of times. No world is a mirage. So what is that then? Just Brahman and nothing else. So another way of saying nothing else is there's no 2 things, only one thing, Brahman. So Advaita. Okay. And then the opposing school, they say, okay, everything is God. So that in that sense, it's non-dual, but they're going to understand non-duality very differently. They're going to say it's Vishishta-Advaita. There's differences in the non-duality. There's a real world, real God, real soul. Okay, it's all God. It's just like the sun and the sunlight. Are they one or are they different? It's sort of one, right? Because the sunlight comes from the sun, but they're different because here I'm sitting in the sunlight. I'm not sitting in the sun. The Ramanuja takes a position like that. He says, okay, in one way it's non-dual, but there's differentiated. It's a differentiated non-duality. I know that sounds complicated. But think about it. There's differences, so it's differentiated. There's differences. Well, there's a difference between the light and the sun. There's also one. But how about we call it differentiated non-duality or differentiated oneness? Another term for oneness is not 2. So that's non-dual. So differentiated non-duality. Sounds terrible until you break it apart, then it's not so bad. All right, so we'll have to learn that term, Vishishta-Advaita, when the time comes. So then we have the logicians now. They're not quoting scripture. They're using reason and argument to say there must be, basically science, philosophy, reason and argument. You look at an effect and you make inferences about its cause. Right. So there's dark matter. Why? We haven't seen it. Well, certain effects in the universe lead the scientists to propose the best way of explaining it, at least, though maybe not the only. But the best is to posit there is 90% of the universe. I'm not a physicist, so correct me if I make any mistakes. 90% of the universe must be pervaded by something. Let's call it dark matter. Why? Because we can't see it. And that's an inference coming from effects. So the Nyāya logicians are going to be using recent, cause-effect arguments to posit a supreme being. Right. So that's now real philosophy. In a sense that would be, a member of the Rutgers philosophy department would relate to that more than Vedanta, which is scriptural interpretation. Okay, and then we look at yoga and experience, actual experience of God, experience of the self. We look at yoga and the role of yoga in Īśvara. Īśvara, remember, meaning the term for God, in actual practice. So the Indian traditions is not just about believing in God. Other theistic traditions about belief, 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 and then you die and hope you go to heaven, right? If you've been a good this, that, or the other. Indian tradition is always about you can experience it in the here and now. You can experience your own deep level self, and you can have a vision of God. How about that? We see in the Old Testament there were some prophets that had a vision of God, and the other parts of the Old Testament that says, well, God cannot be perceived. So you have different sorts of statements. Moses, for example, when he went to get the 10 Commandments, saw the back of God. So yoga says, yeah, why not? I can't perceive God. God can appear. I can't say God can't do something, because that's not God then, is it? God is, if there is a God, it must be an omnipotent. Otherwise, what's the point in having a God if he's not omnipotent? And there's also feminine forms. We say she, but Īśvara is a masculine now, but they're just so that we know. So we'll be saying he for Īśvara, and philosophical argumentation mostly revolves around Īśvara, the masculine form. But just so you know, Indian theism, all the great, when God manifests, there's almost, not quite all, manifests with a feminine counterpart. So Shiv Parvati, Shiva, great form of Īśvara, Lakshmi Narayana, Radha Krishna. Let's talk about that when the time comes. We're getting towards the end of the course, actually, because the last week, week 12, we're going to be looking at Īśvara God breaking into human space and time, my friends. And we'll be looking specifically, we don't want to jump all over the place. Let's go with Krishna, famous from the Bhagavad Gita, beautiful, beloved incarnation of Vishnu. And we'll see some beautiful stories of him as a little child. And we have 2 weeks left over, and we probably use some of those. But if not, we'll read more stories about Īśvara in the world. My other course I'm teaching this semester is Krishna. So we're just reading the entire life of Krishna. That's the course, my friends. Decide if it sounds interesting. Decide if you, so we've got 20 minutes. Let's go to the Rig Veda. First, hit the pause button if you don't have it handy, and go into Canvas and download the Rig Veda. This is the earliest Sanskrit text. No philosophy here, but here we see in a late hymn, linguists will date the Rig Veda as the oldest Sanskrit text, but even within the Rig Veda, linguists will see differences within it. So later language and older language, just like in English, we have later language, right? We have earlier language, we have Beowulf, we have Chaucer. And English is different from Shakespeare to modern day, to our present day and age. So language changes in the course of, English, my country, England, and American English is differences, and so forth. So this is the first kind of, scholars like to see this as the first real, again, we don't know, but there may have been so many philosophers 2000 BCE, but I assume there would certainly have been. Why do we think we're somehow better than the ancients? I don't think so. But we can only judge the ancients, or think about the ancients, or engage the ancients in terms of whatever they've left for us. Archaeologists are going to do their thing looking at artifacts, but literary, philosophers can only seek the literary record. So this is the earliest philosophical expression we find in the literary record. Let's look at it. We won't read the whole thing. 7 verses. I love it. Talking about the beginning of everything. Let's read the first verse. Then even non-existence was not there, nor existence. There was neither existence nor non-existence. Sat and asat. These become important terms. Brahman that we've spoken about becomes sat, that which is. Sat means that which is ongoingly. It's ongoing. It's actually being. Ing means, like walking, talking. The ing form is called present active participle. And as long as you remain in that state, it's an ongoing state. So walking, I'm walking. So that means you keep doing it until you announce that you've stopped. So if something is always in an ing state, it means it's eternally in that state. So sat is being, it's always existing. So the first line says, but then there was neither, what was there? Was it being or non-being? maybe not being like we know, because it's not creation that we know, but it's not non-being either. So there were even non-existence was not there, nor existence. There was no air then, no space. What covered it? What's the it? Reality. Again, we can speculate about the meaning. You know, scholars will understand this differently. Where was it? Where was this, whatever this universe comes from? Let's call it it. Where was it? What covered it? Where was it? In whose keeping? Was it our God? Now we see in whose keeping. That's suggesting what latest thinkers are going to say is God. Was there then cosmic fluid in depths unfathomed? The notion of water, very interesting. You see it in Genesis as well. In the beginning, there was water, right? There was water. So we have the same here. So some very interesting ancient notion that the beginning of creation is somehow associated with water. Then there was neither death nor immortality, right? Because there was no one around. Nor was there then the torch of night and day before creation. The one, oh, we have a one here. Is this a godlike entity? Well, some later thinkers are going to say that's Īśvara. The one breathed windlessly and self-sustaining, because there's no wind. Hadn't been created, but somehow breathed windlessly and self-sustaining. Didn't need anything else because nothing else had been created. So it's our first sort of philosophical stirrings in Sanskrit literature. There was that one then, and there was no other. So there's a one. But Shankara could say the one is Brahman, couldn't he? We know the world is a mirage and there's no soul. So Shankara could make sense of this in Advaita, right? The Vedantin that we mentioned. But the theist Ramanuja, who believes in God in the real world, he could say, yeah, that was God, but he hadn't created the world yet. So both can, later Vedantins are going to be reading the same text. That's what it means to be a Vedantin. You're reading the Upanishads and the Vedas. Reading exactly the same text. It's not that they're reading different texts and coming out with different metaphysical points of view. They're reading exactly the same text, but coming out with different interpretations. And we can see why. So that one, well, very vague, very nondescriptive. At first, there was only darkness, wrapped in darkness, because there hadn't been light, there was no sun. Nothing had been created. All this was only unillumined cosmic water. Back to the water. That one which came to be, enclosed in nothing, not in a universe, not in space, not in time, closed in nothing. We can't understand that with our minds. Our minds are bound by space and time. We can't understand something existing in nothing. We don't understand what nothing is. So it's conceptual for us. But I hope you find this beautiful. That one which came to be, enclosed in nothing, arose at last, born of the power of knowledge. Somehow, this almost seems to suggest that one also emerges. Born of the power of knowledge, born from knowledge. So, what does it mean? No one can definitively say what this means. Later theologians and Vedantins they'll give their opinion and you can develop your own opinions. But this is very, very early metaphysical speculation. So you can read the rest of it. In the beginning, desire descended on it. So therefore that desire to create. Like in the Old Testament, right? God desired to creates in 7 days. So something like that, perhaps. In the beginning, desire descended on it. That was the primal seed born of the mind. So the one sort of the thinking, desire emerges to create. That's the primal seed of creation. You could read it that way. The sages who have searched their hearts with wisdom, obviously later sages, when they're looking for the truth, they're searching their minds. What is the truth? And some of them come to the place that there is God. Some of them come to the place that there's Brahman, but impersonal truth. Whatever they come to. But the sages, they're searching in their hearts, right? They're using their minds. The heart. By the way, whenever it says heart in Sanskrit literature, it means the mind or the intellect. The sages will search their hearts with wisdom. Not just seeking random mundane things. They're looking for ultimate truth. Know that which is kin to that which is not. Something like going back to the idea of existence and non-existence. Somehow or other, that which is connected to something which is different from it all. So not all this. So the cause, like what's the cause of Big Bang? Well, that must be, right? Scientists can't answer that question. If they're honest scientists, they just say that's not in our discipline. If scientists start talking about what pre-Big Bang, they're not talking as scientists, they're talking as metaphysicians. They're changing discipline. Let's be clear about that. Science cannot say anything about pre-Big Bang. Science begins, space and time, Big Bang, cause and effect. All that is a metaphysical domain. Sometimes bad scientists forget that, or bad science starts making speculations. Nothing wrong with making speculations about pre-Big Bang, but then it's bad because if you do that in the name of science, then you're crossing disciplines without irresponsibly. So a good scientist will say, okay, science can't tell us anything about pre-Big Bang, but now I'm going to give you my view and my own metaphysical view. That's wonderful. That's honest, and we honor that. Okay, just want to throw that out. So those sages, right, early scientists, meditation, experiential, hypothesis, experimentation, verification. There's something scientific about, maybe not the same science as we understood it. It's observable because it's interior. That's it. But it is repeatable and it's verifiable personally, yogic experience. We wouldn't call it science because it's not objectively verifiable, but it is repeatable and it is based on a hypothesis that there's an Atman or there's a God, and then a yogic method of experimentation, and there's a verification. But the only one that can verify is the one that does the internal work, the internal practice of yoga. In that sense, we wouldn't call it science, but it has science-like aspects to it. I think it's fair to say that. So the sages who have searched their hearts with wisdom know that which is kin to that which is not. Connection, it's kin. The effect is somehow connected to the cause, whatever the cause is, the one. And then we have verses we don't understand, and they have stretched their cord across the void. The number of speculations you read about in later literature. What is that cord? Some say it's the mantra that connects this world to the divine world. This mantra is, on one hand, it's this world, it's a sound like Om, but contained within it is divinity, is whatever that. Let's talk about that another time. How are we doing for time? 1 hour? Oh, we're going 10 minutes, my friends. And they know what was above. Okay. These are the sages. All right, let's go. I love this. Is my favorite 2 words. Hopefully you'll really enjoy this. Number 6 and 7. But after all, who knows? They weren't that closed-minded. They were saying, okay, we may believe this and that, but who knows? Who can say whence it all came? When does this world come from? And how creation happened? Who knows? The gods themselves are later than creation, and that's not God, Īśvara with a big G, one supreme being. When we have the little g, in the Indian traditions and Buddhism and Jainism, just like the Greeks and Romans, there were celestial beings that were just beings like, from the Indian point of view, beings like us, trapped by karma, so they're not necessarily enlightened, and they're bound by death. They're not, even though they're called immortals, they're not really immortal. They just live so long that they seem to be immortal. So, we'll encounter them all over the place, the gods. When it's with a small g in the plural, it's just, you could become a god if you do well in Hindu philosophy. If you do all your reading, listen to the lectures, your next life you become a celestial, but you can't stay there. Stay there for enormous periods of time. You have to be really, really good karma, though. Really good karma. Then you get to be a celestial. Okay, and then you have power. It's like you could be a senator. Nothing stopping you and I from becoming a senator. It's not some different species of life. If you work really hard and do your, canvas and campaign, you can become a senator and have access to power. But you don't stay there. Eventually you get voted out or you just get old. Still subject to the same laws of old age. So the celestials are like that, and they're called gods. I call them celestials myself, but you'll find them written as gods. So plural, then but Īśvara is the one supreme God, the one supreme absolute monotheistic God, right? Īśvara, and that would be G with a big G, capital G, and singular. But these gods, these celestial beings themselves are later than creation. They're created. In other words, the author is saying, yeah, the gods are created just like we are. So they are after creation. So they can't tell you who, where, you know, what was pre-Big Bang. So who knows truly whence it has arisen? I love it. And now this is my favorite verse, verse 7. And then I think we'll have to wrap up. I was holding to read a brief verse or two, but it doesn't matter. We're just not going to be, we're going to go with the flow, my friends. This is philosophy. Okay, let's just let the teachings capture our minds and take us wherever they're going to take us, and enjoy this journey together on, you know, exploring the ways of looking at reality 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 2,000 miles away. Right, that's where you're at college. It's an opportunity to explore different points of view, step out of the box, and look at, you know, and these traditions are alive. With Hinduism, you know, fifth of the world or whatever, and Buddhism shares, you know, comes out of this matrix. And so that's, what's that now? Add Hinduism and Buddhism, now you got what, 2/5 of the world. And pervading our Western, you know, yoga philosophy, you know, under the radar. People doing yoga and they're absorbing ideas. I think we did a course last semester. I think 25% of Americans now believe in reincarnation. Where's that coming from? Since the 60s. It's not coming from Plato. People are not suddenly reading Plato, even though he did believe in reincarnation. It's coming from Eastern thought. So, but people are becoming, you know, accepting Eastern thought without thinking, oh, I'm becoming a Hindu. They just think, oh, you know, I accept reincarnation. So it's kind of seeping into our West now. Many of these ideas, pure consciousness, innermost self. I know that. I have a lot of, you know, strong connections with the yoga community. I lecture often. So, all right, so therefore, we are going to go on this journey together. And if you have no background, then it'll be great. If you are from South Asia, don't think you know Indian philosophy. Just because you know, stories from the Mahabharata or Krishna or Rama, you go to the temple. We're going to be studying philosophy. You don't get that from Amachitra Katha comics these are great comics that Indian kids, you know, some of them grow up with. Amachitra Katha, they're fantastic. I had my daughter read them when she was little. But that's not philosophy. Those are beautiful stories, and they're philosophically laden. Philosophy is there. That's how most Indians learn their Hinduism is from stories. Just like most Christians, they don't study the Christian philosophers. How many Christians studied Augustine or Origen, the early church fathers, Aquinas? Very few, unless you're in a seminary. So just because you're Hindu, don't think you have a head start on this. This is not going to be something most of you, I venture to say almost all of you, perhaps there's a few exceptions, will find this new and hopefully that's stimulating because of that. Final verse. Whence all creation had its origin, right? We're all philosophy, our course is focused on God, the cause. So whence all creation had its origin, the creator. Oh, by the way, I should be bringing this up. I could be bringing this up. I'm so sorry. I forgot all about that. Let's bring it up. Okay, we want. There we are. I was looking at my face. Here we are. And I'll be bringing this up normally if I remember. So there we're on verse 7 of Rig Veda, book 10 of the Rig Veda. And it is book 10 and 129, hymn 129. Last one. Whence all creation had its origin. Whence? From where? The creator. Whether he fashioned it or whether he did not. We're talking about the creator. Well, surely a creator is someone who creates. But this is so free and open and intellectually vibrant. It says whether he fashioned it. Well, obviously he's the creator. What does it mean to be a creator? But it goes too far as to say, oh, whether he did not. Actually, later Hinduism is going to say the creator of the universe took pre-existing matter and created the universe. And they're going to posit Vishnu as the creator of matter itself. And then Brahma, as the first of the celestial beings, who just has a job to do like an engineer. He takes that matter and creates the universe. So could it be something like that? So Brahma, not Brahman. I won't explain the difference now. But Brahman ends in an N. That's what we've been using. That's the term we've been using so far for the absolute truth. Brahman. But there's a celestial who, confusingly, until someone tells you, is called Brahma with a long A, not with an N. He's a celestial, 4 heads, and he's the secondary creator. So could it be talking about that? Vaishnavas would say that. They would say, whence all creation had its origin, the creator, right? Whether he fashioned it or whether he did not. The creator who surveys it all from highest heaven. He knows whence it all come from, but look at this. Maybe even he does not know. Isn't that lovely? I just showed you such an open-hearted engagement with knowledge. It's not fanatical. It's not fundamental. It's not dogmatic. It's a beautiful hymn, my friends. So there we have it. And the time is now, what is the time? Should be up there somewhere. Oh, I have to stop share. Stop share. Your screen sharing. Stop. Oh, there we are. We're back to this, and it's 1 hour and 17 minutes. And first class then, 1 hour, 20 minutes. We'll try to honor that as much as we can. If we spill over, you'll forgive me once in a while. Or if we do, then I'll try to make the next class a bit shorter. Okay, so Swagatam, welcome. I've dedicated my life to, that's all I do is read Indian philosophy and religion. That's all that interests me these days, getting white hair. So I'm getting close to death. So 65, but closer than most of you anyway. And I'm happy to share, I love to share these teachings. That's what I do with my life. So that's it. So we'll stop. And maybe if I come up with set times to record this, give me a week or so to, I've got to go down there and help my neighbor now, but give me a week or so to record and settle down. And then maybe I'll let you know when I'm going to record and you can join and then you can ask questions. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? If I can come up with a set time, let's say Monday and Wednesday is Sanskrit. Well, let me think about it. And then I'll let you know. You don't have to, but if you would like to, I would love to meet some of you, or maybe you can join sometimes and not other times. But let's try to make that available at least sometimes. That would be nice. So I'm not just talking to my face in the screen. And I get to know some of you like the good old days in the classroom. Okay, have a great Labor Day weekend and enjoy the sun. Who knows how much more we're going to get. And we're right on the button and I'm going to hit stop. Namaskar.